How far back does the story of fermentation and human beings go?
Well, I mean, part of it depends how you define fermentation. I mean, the way biologists define fermentation as anaerobic metabolism, the earliest forms of life on Earth, long before the emergence of humans, were fermentation. And so, and all multicellular life forms have been host to diverse bacteria, fermenting bacteria. So, I mean, as long back as humans go, and much longer, fermentation is part of the story. When external fermentation, intentional fermentation began, highly speculative. Like the archaeological record tells us at least 10,000 years, but I would argue that that tells us more about the history of pottery than it tells us about the history of fermentation, because presumably the earlier vessels were all things that are totally biodegradable, like gourds, wood, various kinds of animal membranes. So, let's just say the human practice of fermentation is quite ancient.
Yeah, and I guess even seeking out fermented items when we were still hunter-gatherers is something that's been going on for tens of thousands of years, well before civilization.
Yeah, and also there was this sort of mutation in the primates that preceded us that allowed for the metabolism of alcohol. And so, I think we can presume that, if that mutation stayed, it conferred some advantage to them. And, the general thinking is that, that enabled these primates to come out of the canopy onto the ground and sustain themselves primarily on fermenting fruit.
Yeah. Yeah, is it right that great apes can metabolize alcohol, but monkeys cannot? And so that's the sort of division there in the evolutionary chain. So you have gorillas and bonobos and chimpanzees and hominids, humans, Homo sapiens, that can all do this alcohol thing and party.
Yeah, so it's really part of what defines us, and it's not necessarily in order to party. One could argue that it's to be able to digest these fallen, already fermenting fruits, and that the earlier primates who were eating it couldn't eat enough fruit to experience inebriation, but just the ability to tolerate the alcohol, to not be hurt by the alcohol, conferred the advantage. But, obviously, at some point, our ancestors began to enjoy larger accumulations.
I mean, arguably, it's a macronutrient. I mean, it's fuel, it is energy source, right? And, along the same lines as protein, fat, and carbohydrate. I mean, I don't think a nutritionalist would generally sort of divvy up the pie chart of macronutrients quite that way, but ultimately it is a source of calories. And I suppose when survival is the motivation,
Well,
metabolize it.
And also, earlier spontaneously fermented beverages and foods, just generally had much lower alcohol accumulations. And so there's a lot of historical examples documented of, people relying on more lightly fermented beverages as important sources of carbohydrates.
So since this sort of early experimentations with fermentation, it feels like it's something broad in its broadest sense that has really taken over the food space. And yet so many people seem to be unaware of the vast range of products that we eat that do go through some fermentation or another. So I think it might be worth just sort of spelling it out, the range of foods and drinks that we consume that involve fermentation.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, broadly speaking, fermentation is the transformative action of microorganisms. There's nothing we could possibly eat that cannot be fermented in a variety of ways. People in every part of the world practice fermentation. It's really integral to culinary practices everywhere. When I try to imagine, why is it that fermentation is so universal? Why is it practiced everywhere? The conclusion I come to is the simple reality that microbiology has now illuminated for us that all of the plants and all of the animal products that make up our food are populated by microorganisms. So there's a certain inevitability of microbial transformation of our food. And, our current understanding of fermentation was only established in the second half of the 19th century. But, the general observations that, under these conditions, food decomposes into a disgusting, ugly mess. And under these contrasting conditions, the food is somehow elevated. It becomes more stable for preservation. It becomes more delicious. It becomes more digestible. Some toxic compound gets removed. People everywhere learned how to work with this invisible life force that's part of all of our food. And, the range of things, I mean, from the standard Western diet, bread is fermented, cheese is fermented, cured meats are fermented, condiments are either directly fermented or rely upon vinegar, which is a product of fermentation, to stabilize them. Some styles of olives are fermented, pickles are fermented. Obviously, beer and wine and spirits all involve fermentation. Um, there's just a vast range. I mean, when you go into other parts of the world, I mean, things like fish sauce, things like soy sauce, miso, incredible range of flatbreads, and even fermented porridges that people enjoy around the world. So I mean, there's a huge diversity. I mean, many people don't realize that chocolate involves fermentation. It's the cacao at the place where it's harvested. Coffee involves fermentation. Vanilla involves fermentation. Certain styles of tea involve fermentation. It's a pretty vast area of human cultural practice.
Yeah, most of the delicious stuff as well, it seems. I was having breakfast this morning, and you have to forgive me, I don't come to New York very often, so I thought, well, I'll have a bagel, because that seems like quite a New York thing to do. I ordered a Reuben bagel, which seems even more New York thing to do. And I was sat there with my coffee, eating it and drinking the coffee, and it struck me that literally every part of this, although I'm not sure pastrami is actually a fermented cured meat. I think it's cured, but maybe not fermented. But anyway, forgive me that. Let's pretend it was salami. So you got the salami, pastrami, sauerkraut. It's got some sort of mayonnaise in there, which has obviously got a vinegar base. Like you say, vinegar's fermented. The bagel itself obviously has had yeast added to it and has been fermented. Then the cup of coffee as well. The sauerkraut, did I mention that? Literally every component of this has gone through some sort of fermentation in order to get it there. And yet, I think that just wouldn't occur to most people. Most people, they overlook the fact that bread is fermented. They overlook the fact that beer is fermented and spirits are made from a fermented base.
Well, I mean, because of the nature of what I do, I've been a fermentation educator for decades. I've written books about fermentation. Every now and then I'll be at some random party and I'll start talking to a stranger and they'll say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I'll say like, I write and I teach about fermentation. And then there's this face that people sometimes make, like, really what they're associating the word fermentation with maybe the strongest flavor fermented thing they ever smelled or tasted that was too much for them. And so they say, "Oh, I don't like fermented foods." And then I'm like, "Oh, poor you. Wow, what a restrictive diet you must have. Like, no bread, no cheese, no cured meats, no condiments, no pickles, no chocolate, no, and I just go through the list, and then they're like, "Oh my God, I love all those things." I just meant that, like, I didn't like Roquefort cheese, or, I tried a kimchi that was, too spicy for me. So, it's easy for people to sort of, project, exoticism or, overpowering aromas or flavors onto the idea of fermentation. And I mean, of course, fermentations sometimes have, really, really strong flavors that not everybody will love. But, the point for me is that fermentation is so thoroughly integral to, food traditions everywhere that almost everybody, almost everywhere, eats and drinks products of fermentation all the time without necessarily thinking about it at all.
Yeah, it seems like there's been some kind of negative PR campaign surrounding it. I mean, even the language that is used to describe it, microbe, bacteria, yeast, mold, all of those have, to some degree or another, a lesser or a negative connotation to it. And maybe, I guess, they suffer from being a bit too vague as terms. Like if I said, oh, there's mold on the wall of my shower, and then I said, oh, I used Koji mold to make this rice taste delicious. Obviously, I mean two entirely different things, but the word is being used on two very different scenarios.
Yeah, well, I mean, the filamentous fungi are, a similar phenomenon, and there's a lot of different kinds of filamentous fungi, as there are many different kinds of bacteria, as there are many different kinds of yeasts, as there are many different kinds of plants, as there are many different kinds of animals, and biodiversity is the rule, and I mean. It's interesting to me that, people have been practicing fermentation for thousands of years. It's so integral to our food traditions, but we've really only begun to have an idea of what drives that process, really since, Louis Pasteur's groundbreaking work in the second half of the 19th century. But, almost as soon as he proved that bacteria and yeast were the driving forces in fermentation. He and others began to recognize that certain diseases were driven by bacteria, and so as soon as people began to hear of the existence of bacteria and other microorganisms, they began to associate them with danger and disease and death. So, in the popular imagination, these things were scary to people and remain scary, except that I think that, the popular understanding of it is shifting, because more and more people are recognizing the important role that bacteria and other microorganisms play in our in our bodies, in our physiology, in our functionality. And, now we recognize that every, healthy human being is host to, many trillions of bacteria and many other kinds of microorganisms. And, these organisms are not, parasitic or freeloaders. They actually give us a lot of our functionality, and, a lot of health problems may be derived from diminished biodiversity in our guts. And so, many people are recognizing the importance of, maintaining, restoring, building biodiversity in the gut. And, that's what, probiotics are all about. That's what people get from eating, raw, unpasteurized, fermented foods. And so, I mean, I do think it's shifting, but yeah, I mean, a lot of people, just have a sort of knee-jerk aversion to the idea of that. I mean, the first time I taught people how to make sauerkraut, I remember very vividly the reaction of this, one young woman in the workshop looked at the jar of cabbage we had just shredded and salted and pounded and stuffed into jars, and she was like, "How can I be sure I have good bacteria growing in here and not some dangerous bacteria that might make me sick or kill somebody?" And this is a very common concern. It's really easy to, project this anxiety onto the idea of fermentation when, in fact, fermentation above all else is a strategy for safety. I mean, what good is a strategy for preservation if it doesn't keep food safe?
No, if like one time out of 10, it creates a horrible, deadly virus or bacteria or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, fermented vegetables in particular are just about as safe as food gets. I mean, there's just no history of food poisoning or illness. Statistically speaking, fermented vegetables are much safer than raw vegetables.
Yeah.
And with every kind of food, fermentation makes it safer.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that statement there. I think even to people who eat fermented food just sounds incredible to sort of say, well, it's safer than fresh ingredients. And I mean, can obviously, if you work through the science of this, well, if you do have anything dangerous on the surface of your shredded carrots, then when you create an environment for a malolactic fermentation, that new bacteria that comes in is then going to basically chase it out and create acidic environment.
Kill it.
Yeah. And actually then it starts to make sense. But again, I think like in a way, I think there's a few things at work here. One of which is that we've, I think in modern times, been trained to think that fresh is great, right? The fresher the better. So the idea of
I mean, I wouldn't argue with that. I mean, I love fresh food, and
yeah, but then if if you believe that, then the idea of leaving something to sit around for a couple of weeks sort of seems to fly in the face of it. Even though that is also great. So I think there's that side of it, and then I guess the other thing is fast food, right? We just want things immediately. We don't have patience, right? We want, not only do I want my groceries delivered, I now actually want the entire meal kit delivered so I can prepare it in 20 minutes and be told exactly how to do it. I don't have time to let even a pot boil for 6 hours, never mind stick something in a Kilner jar and let it sit there for a week or two, or perhaps even longer if I'm making some interesting mold thing, whatever. So there's a challenge there, I think, in terms of the sort of way in which we approach food and drink, in that we expect instant results. We don't have that patience.
well, I mean, I would say a few things. I mean, first of all, for people who are interested in making food for themselves, I mean, let's just take a jar of sauerkraut as an example. It'll take you like 10 or 15 minutes to like shred the veggies and start the kraut. And then you might have to wait a week or a couple of weeks. But, then you have something at the ready for when you do want to throw together a quick sandwich. You can make it, much more substantial, much more delicious, much more nutritious. So, it's investing a little bit of time now
Bit of planning
for a benefit that you'll derive later. And of course, it's not like you have to just sit and watch it for the week or two that it's fermenting. You go about your business and it goes about its business. I mean, you're in the, you're in the business of, serving spirits to people. I mean, what are people going to like, make their own 12-year aged whiskey? I mean, it's really, it's no different really. Like, you can still enjoy these things. Like, you don't have to be the one making the Parmesan cheese that has to age for 2 years.
Yeah.
But I mean, the thrust of my work really is, empowering people who want to make these things themselves, that they don't need to be intimidated by it. Like, fermentation is not rocket science. It does not require incredible precision. And so, for anyone who's interested in exploring it, and it turns out there are a lot of people interested in exploring it, it's very accessible. And although, certainly, there are elaborate techniques that take a lot of work, there are simpler techniques that you can do in a more streamlined way. So I think the important thing to me is that people not be intimidated by it. It's not important to me that everybody make everything that they eat, but I do think it can be very satisfying. It can be very delicious, and certainly it can enable you to eat a lot better.
Yeah, I want to get into practical techniques in a bit. But first, let's rewind back again, not quite as far as protozoa and the origins of bacterial life and single-cell organisms on Earth, but back to your younger years. How did you get into this world of fermentation?
Well, here we are in New York City. I grew up in New York. My grandparents were immigrants from what's now Belarus, and I grew up eating pickles, and the pickles that we were eating are what we called sour pickles. Outside of New York, they're sometimes called kosher dills, but they're cucumbers fermented in a saltwater brine with garlic and dill. And I didn't know how they were made. I didn't know that they were fermented, but I loved that flavor. And so, from, just like a very early age, I was very drawn to the flavor of lactic acid. In my mid-20s, I spent a couple of years following a macrobiotic diet, and that's what first got me thinking about digestive and other health benefits.
What's a macrobiotic diet? In case you haven't heard, this is going to be the summer of the Paloma. It's a fantastic long tequila drink, the bedfellow of the margarita, citrusy, fresh, and incredible vibrant pink color. If you're going to make this drink, then you're going to need this from my sponsor, Fever Tree, their pink grapefruit soda. Made with fresh, ruby red grapefruits, it adds that wonderful sweet, sour, and slightly bitter tang to a nice Paloma. Take yourself a highball glass, Fill it up with plenty of ice, add a splosh of your favorite tequila, and then top up with Fever-Tree's pink grapefruit soda. Finally, and most importantly, finish with a slice of pink grapefruit. Now, let's get back to the show.
Macrobiotics is a Japanese-inspired dietary movement that was, very popular in the 70s and 80s, and it's become more obscure today. But, macrobiotics really emphasized the digestive benefit of pickles and other kinds of living ferments. And I started noticing that these pickles that I'd been eating my entire life, whenever I would bite into them, I could feel the salivary glands under my tongue squirting out saliva, and I really began to associate these foods with getting my digestive juices flowing. And I still wasn't making them, but I was, really like consciously seeking them out to eat more regularly. But, the thing that spurred me to learn about fermentation is in 1993, I moved from New York to rural Tennessee. And among the many changes in my life at that time, I started gardening. And, I was such a naive city kid. It had never occurred to me that in the garden, all of the cabbage would be ready at about the same time. All of the radishes would be ready at about the same time. So that first year that I was gardening, we had a beautiful bed of cabbages. And I was like, what are we going to do with all these cabbages at once? And then I had this little epiphany. I was like, I love sauerkraut. And I know sauerkraut has something to do with preserving cabbages, but I had no idea how it was made or if it was a complicated process or whatever. But I found a recipe. It was deceptively simple. I made my first batch of sauerkraut. I loved it. It was so simple. It was so satisfying. I started playing around with other kinds of vegetables and seasonings. I branched out and learned how to make yogurt, learned how to make blackberry wine. And then I just went completely down the rabbit hole and got obsessed with all things fermented, and started looking in cookbooks for fermentation traditions from other parts of the world. And here I am.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Finally made it to this podcast. I started gardening in earnest last year. So this is like my second year of it, and actually this year has gone like full pelt. At every available space I've planted something to lesser or greater degrees of success, as is the kind of joy of learning to garden properly, I think. But you're absolutely right. Of course, everything's kind of ready at the same time, so you have to work out protocols for dealing with that. Like I've got absolutely tons of tomatoes coming through this year. Can you ferment tomatoes?
Yeah, I mean you can ferment anything. Like there's nothing you could possibly ever eat that cannot be fermented. There's a lot of different ways of fermenting tomatoes.
And be delicious though, because it's not everything. Is everything delicious like when you ferment it?
There's nothing that is intrinsically not delicious. Differences. So
it's subjective, right?
You can't ferment a tomato in exactly the same ways you can ferment cabbage. Like if you try to ferment tomatoes for months, it generally will it'll get just incredibly sour, and the tomatoes can't hold their form unless they're green. So there's a lot of traditions of pickling green tomatoes. My grandfather loved pickled green tomatoes, fermented green tomatoes. They get very sour, but they remain really firm. There's a lot of Russian traditions of like fermenting whole, like cherry tomatoes, but generally they'll do that before they're fully ripe. But also you can use ripe tomatoes. You can make tomato preparations like, salsas, and you can ferment them for a couple of days, and you can enhance the flavor, certainly like build up lots of probiotic activity and then enjoy it, but it's not something that will preserve it for long periods of time. In my book, The Art of Fermentation, I have a recipe for like a traditional old fermented tomato paste. You have to understand, like canning as we know it was invented in France at the very beginning of the 19th century. So it's just over a 200 year old technology. That's mostly what I do when I have a lot of tomatoes is I can them. It's just an easy way to preserve them.
I was going to puree them and like vac pack them and stick them in the freezer as well, because then you just defrost it. But
No, I mean, that's if you have the freezer space, that's very practical as well. But you have to understand, like, until 100 years ago, nobody had a freezer. Until 200 years ago, there was no way of canning things. So people worked with dehydration, people worked with fermentation, people worked with preserving things in vinegar, there's all kinds of ways you can ferment tomatoes, but they have their own unique qualities. Not every food has equally prominent traditions of fermentation. I've never run across any traditional fermentations of avocado, for instance. But if you mash up an avocado in salted cabbage, you can make beautiful avocado kraut. It probably wouldn't have the potential to last as long because the very oily avocado might begin to go rancid after some period of time. But it's really delicious for a short-term fermentation. I mean, there's tons of fermentation around the world of pork. There's very little fermentation of chicken. You can certainly ferment chicken, but there's just less practical necessity to do so because, you
can eat the whole
slaughter a chicken and you eat the whole thing in a meal. Yeah. Like you slaughter an 800-pound pig and you can't eat the whole thing in a meal.
That's so interesting. The tradition is kind of proportionate to the size of the animal.
The traditions are proportionate with necessity.
Yeah.
In the tropics, you don't see a lot of fermentation of vegetables. Not none. Like there's some fermentation of vegetables in tropical places, but like in temperate places with very short growing seasons, it's a survival practice. Like because, if you're going to have 6 months of the year with no fresh vegetables, there's, like a necessity to preserve vegetables so you can have some vitamin C so people don't get scurvy. And, it's not that people necessarily understood all of that, but, there's a lot of places in the world where vegetables only grow during very limited periods of the year. And so preservation is just more necessary. And really, like, all fermentation practices are driven by necessity, with the possible exception of alcoholic beverages, which aren't necessary, but certainly are the most widespread form of fermentation because people love the alterations that come with drinking alcohol
and the flavor as well. Okay, so I want to get to alcohol in a little bit. Before that, let's discuss the different microbes at play here. So we have yeast, we have bacteria, we have molds. Is there anything else?
I mean, those are basically the three major known groups of organisms that are involved, and of course, molds and yeast both are in the fungi category. So it's basically bacteria and fungi drive fermentation, and certain processes involve just like a single organism, but many traditional processes involve groups of organisms, different kinds of organisms growing, and so sometimes you'll have fungi and bacteria growing in the same fermentation.
What's an example of that?
The way I can answer this question is, until the 20th century and our ability to isolate singular organisms, every fungal fermentation always has had bacteria with it. So, today in breweries and distilleries and even wineries, people might be making alcoholic beverages that only involve yeast. But historically, yeast never was found in any natural environment, still is not found in any natural environment without lactic bacteria. So, this revival of natural wines, of sour beers, until yeast was isolated, all wines were natural wines, driven by the community of organisms that could be highly variable that's found on the grapes. All beers were sour beers because, there was no ability to isolate yeast from lactic bacteria. If we look at things like soy sauce or miso, these involve, growing koji, which is a fungus, Aspergillus oryzae, but in its traditional manifestations, it was a little bit more biodiverse than that, and not necessarily like a singular strain. And then you mix that with a brine, and then over the course of the year or longer fermentation, you also develop lactic bacteria. You also develop yeasts. So, it involves mold, bacteria, and yeast. Certain kinds of cheeses involve molds, bacteria, and yeast. But, biodiversity really is the, it's the rule.
Yeah. Is it fair to say, though, for some fermentations, something like sauerkraut, where it's a lactic acid bacteria fermentation, the aim really there is to create conditions that are not conducive to the growth of mold or yeast cultures?
Yeah. So sure. And really all fermentation practices amount to simple manipulations of environmental conditions, which have the effect of encouraging the growth of certain organisms while simultaneously discouraging the growth of other kinds of organisms. So, let's say we just took a bowl of cabbage and we shredded it and we left it loosely shredded in the bowl. The mold are always going to be the first ones that dominate, because if you leave it loosely shredded, there's all of this air circulating. There's lots of oxygen.
Because they're aerobic, the molds.
What's that?
Is that because mold is aerobic?
Molds are aerobic, and every time you use half of a cabbage and the other half of the cabbage sits around, in the drawer in your refrigerator, on the counter in your kitchen, you'll get a little film of mold developing there. So there's always spores there. Everything we ever eat has spores of molds. They can't really access the nutrients, but as soon as you slice through the cabbage, they can. And even in a cool environment, they will grow. And so you magnify that when you have a bowl of shredded cabbage. There's all these surfaces with cabbage juice oozing out that the mold spores can access to begin to grow. So like a bowl of loosely shredded cabbage in a room hot and humid like this one, it'll just become like a cloud of hairy mold that would reduce that cabbage to a puddle of slime that bears no resemblance whatsoever to delicious, tangy, crunchy sauerkraut. So the condition for fermenting vegetables is to get them submerged. We salt the vegetables, usually with sauerkraut. You don't add water. It's generically known as the dry salting method. So you lightly salt it, and then if you want to speed up the process, you pound it, you squeeze it. But what you're doing is breaking down cell walls. The salt is drawing water out, and you can speed up that process by squeezing it and breaking down cell walls. And then once the vegetables get juicy, you can pack them into your jar, your barrel, your crock, whatever kind of vessel you're using, but in such a way that the vegetables get submerged. And then you're cutting off the continual circulation of oxygen, so the molds can't grow except maybe on the surface. And that's where you can get a kind of yeast growing that's called a comm yeast, or occasionally you could get like a hairy mold growing. But everything that's submerged is protected, and the lactic acid
So you
bacteria.
could just scrape that off and it would still be...
Yeah.
And then the salt, would that be something that inhibits yeast development within the mixture as well? Because yeast doesn't tend to like salt.
Yeah, sure. So the more salt you use, the more it would be inhibited, but you don't need to use a ton of salt. There's always going to be a little bit of yeast in there. It doesn't much matter. There's always traces of alcohol in sauerkraut because there's inevitably some yeast activity.
Is there anything else to say about the sort of preferences that each of these different microbes have, whether maybe something to do with temperature or humidity, as you mentioned?
Well, sure. All of them. When you're intentionally growing the molds, like Koji mold, tempeh mold. There's cheeses that involve molds. There's actually quite a few other examples of molds, but you need air circulation, you need a certain level of humidity. And generally, you need a fairly warm environment. Um, uh, Lactic acid bacteria have an incredibly wide range. Like it'll grow in the refrigerator, it could grow above body temperature. Yogurt, generally for yogurt, you're trying to maintain a temperature somewhere around 43 degrees Celsius. And lactic acid bacteria will grow at that range. And right now I have a couple of fermentation projects in the refrigerator where the lactic acid bacteria are going at refrigerator temperatures. So, certain organisms have much wider ranges. Certain other organisms have more narrow ranges.
So with bacteria, if you're talking about the pathogenic range of bacteria, how do their preferred conditions differ to lactic acid bacteria? Is it to do with pH or?
Well, I mean, the major thing that's just very convenient for us is that, the vast majority of the bacteria that can be pathogenic to us are acid sensitive. So they cannot survive in an acidic environment. So, this would be true of Clostridium botulinum that produces botulism. This would be true of Salmonella, E. coli, most of the bacteria that can make us sick. So acidity is a huge one, and acidity is like the biggest single factor that keeps most fermented foods so safe.
Yeah. You touched on it already at wild fermentation and sort of natural cultures and how this just used to be the way before we were able to isolate specific strains of yeast or of mold or whatever it might be. Do you want to sort of break that down maybe a little bit more about how you think about cultured fermentations as opposed to wild fermentations?
Yeah. So, the big question in fermentation is, what's driving the fermentation? So, Wild Fermentation, which is the title of my first book about fermentation that was first published in 2003, but that's a phrase that I didn't make up. It's found throughout the literature, and it describes fermentation based on, organisms that are present on the food or, to a limited degree, the environment, your hands, but really like it's mostly about what's on the food. So, in making sauerkraut, shred cabbage, you don't need to add any kind of little starter because all plants growing out of soil on planet Earth are host to lactic acid bacteria. So so they are just there. Traditional wine production, you crush grapes, the juice of the grapes comes into contact with the skins that are covered with yeast and other organisms, and the fermentation just starts. Traditional cider making, exactly the same scenario. So, wild fermentation is just when the fermentation is inevitable because the organisms are on the food. And, once you create the condition that allows them to develop, they do so. Most traditional cheese making is wild fermentation based on, the kinds of organisms that are typically found in raw milk. Now, when we get into something like baking, the yeast that you need to bake bread is on wheat and it's on rye and it's on other grains, but it takes some cultivation. So, what we call a sourdough. You start a sourdough as a wild fermentation. It's just, you mix flour and water together with some water, hopefully unchlorinated, dechlorinated water, because chlorine is added to water in order to kill bacteria and other microorganisms.
It's designed to inhibit bacterial growth, yeah.
But it takes a little cultivation. So you keep on feeding your sourdough and stirring your sourdough, and it takes maybe like a week of cultivation for it to get vigorous enough to rise a loaf of bread. So when you take a previous batch of something and add it to the next batch of something, like the vivid word we have for that in the English language is backslopping. So the sourdough really is backslopping. You always save a little bit of your starter to start the next loaf of bread. Yogurt is made by backslopping. You save a little bit of yogurt to add to milk to make the next bit of yogurt.
It's amazing. I've made yogurt quite a lot over the years, and it's so strange because you can add too much, can't you? It's not as effective if you add too much. Obviously you'll know what the ratio is, but it's really only a small amount you need in order to generate this.
Generally for me, for a liter, I usually use like a quarter of a teaspoon of of starter.
And if you use a tablespoon, it wouldn't be as good.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So this is an ancient form of a starter, is backslopping. I mean, I have a friend who's a beer brewer who, like, in one of his tanks, he always leaves a few gallons of the previous batch, and then he adds the new wort to make the new beer. And so the previous batch functions as the starter for the next batch. So there's a lot of different fermentations where you can use strategies like this. Then there's pure culture starters, like the packet of yeast. That's really only existed since the very end of the 19th century, really only been available, since the early 20th century. And, there's so many different pure culture starters you could buy. You can go to specialized websites for home brewing and home winemaking and buy lots of different varieties of yeast. If you're interested in cheese making, there's all kinds of websites where you can buy pure culture starters to make different styles of cheeses. To make Koji, I use a starter of Aspergillus oryzae that comes from Japan. I buy a natto starter to make natto. There's a lot of pure culture starters, and they can certainly be very convenient and enable you to, make fermentations in different parts of the world, etc. But they're a real departure from the tradition of fermentation because they never existed until the 20th century.
So the decision to do that from your personal point of view would be like, I know it's going to be tricky to get this particular microbe, in high populations and affecting my substrate the way that I want it to. So I'm going to add a cultured starter, a cultured isolated.
Well, or, sometimes starters, let's say they're analogous to seeds and then they've been developed through selection. So, natto, which is the Japanese name for this ferment of whole soybeans, is something that I have come to really love. I've learned over time that in a lot of other places around Asia, people are making natto-like foods as a spontaneous fermentation. And the bacteria that ferments soybeans into natto, Bacillus subtilis, is found on all beans. It's probably found on all vegetables. It's a very common soil bacteria. But in natto production, people have selected a strain of this bacteria that makes, just really copious biofilms. And so the quality of natto, that it's very sort of stringy and mucilaginous, which is a quality of it that puts many people who've never eaten it before off, but, is really part of what makes it special. But Bacillus subtilis is always going to be on your beans and survive boiling, but it won't produce such copious biofilms unless you use the selected strain. So sometimes the pure culture starters can, give you capabilities that you probably would not achieve through spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, they'll emphasize a specific characteristic of the fermentation. So you're saying that natto production in Japan 300 years ago, before the specific strain of bacteria, right, was isolated, would have been less like what you're going to be consuming today?
It's hard to say. Because also people were probably practicing backslopping.
Yeah.
So, the regional natto makers, probably over time developed Bacillus subtilis var natto, which is the selected strain. And
they've basically got a little reactor churning away there that they can keep drawing from. And then is that particular bacteria more prevalent in Japan than it is, say, here in New York?
I couldn't say.
Okay.
I couldn't say. I mean, I have certainly made spontaneous natto in Tennessee, generally with soybeans. Sometimes with soybeans from Tennessee, sometimes with soybeans from North Dakota. And certainly you can make spontaneously fermented Bacillus subtilis, things like natto, and certainly the traditions in Thailand, in southwestern China, in Korea, in northeast India, and related traditions all around West Africa, where they're not using soybeans, but they're fermenting African locust beans. None of these other places are people using a starter, and they're making really delicious things with a characteristic flavor that, like, if you're familiar with natto, you could walk into the room and be like, oh, this is just like natto, but it's made spontaneously. So the big difference with the natto variant is the biofilms, the stringiness.
I think it's one of the really interesting things about fermented products. And I mean, see, I'm most familiar with alcohol, but when you go around the world, and obviously different plants grow in different places because the environment selects them or it encourages them to evolve that way. And then you have the local bacteria and yeast cultures as well. And when you have the two combined, it really is like a fingerprint of that location, the terroir of that location on both the sort of microscopic and macroscopic scale combined. So when you taste that thing, and especially then when you bring in the culture of human beings as well and their sensibilities when it comes to flavor and intensity of taste, and pineapples also grow nearby, so we quite like it when we ferment an alcohol and it tastes slightly pineapple-y too. It's such an incredible sort of snapshot into human culture, but obviously the culture that, of bacteria and of plants that underpins all of that as well.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, fermentation really is like a manifestation of place. And as you say, like what you can grow where, well, easily is a manifestation of place, but then also what organisms are on it, and what is the environment that will determine which of those organisms can develop. So it's totally a manifestation of place. But just to sort of connect with what we were just talking about of the natural variation of the organisms that are present for spontaneous fermentation, in the realm of alcohol. I mean, all grapes, all apples will have yeast, but they'll also have lactic acid bacteria, and there'll be a high amount of variability in that yeast. And that's just always been part of alcohol making. That's why, that's one of the reasons why, the wines from different years, the ciders from different years can have such different characteristics, because, not only the, climactic differences that will determine like sugar levels, acidity levels of the fruits, but also, what particular community of organisms end up on them that year, and then what are the conditions for the fermentation. And I think that it's this intrinsic variability that the early microbiologists who were involved in sort of selecting specific strains were trying to overcome.
Homogenization, really.
Exactly. So exactly what the alcohol tolerance of the strain you use is. You try to get rid of those lactic bacteria, and you're just trying like more and more to like assert control over the process. And I mean, for better and for worse, right? I mean, there's certainly, more predictability, more consistency when you're using pure culture starters. But, from my standpoint, I would say like the best examples in every category that I've had a chance to try. Like the best wines I've had definitely have been through spontaneous fermentation. The best beers that I've had have been through spontaneous fermentation. The best cheeses that I've had have been through spontaneous fermentation. The best breads that I've had have been through spontaneous fermentation. So I think that there's always the potential for them to be, extraordinary. The problem is that there's also the potential for them to have off flavors, and this is why it's sort of the thrust in mass production over the last 200 years has been towards using pure culture starters, and it's really sort of the more fringy artisan practitioners that have been practicing spontaneous fermentation.
Yeah, it does feel like the story of food and drink over the last 150 years has been one of attempting to just achieve consistency in a sort of consumeristic marketplace as we have, where brands have to mean something and you have to know what you're going to buy every single time. And obviously we see this in the alcohol space as, in a big way. When I speak to not all brewers and distillers, but a lot of brewers and distillers, especially the big ones, they're often very excited to tell you about how we have our own proprietary yeast strain. We protect it in this, I've been to one of the most extreme examples. I remember this was Bacardi in Puerto Rico, and I went there, and they treat their yeast like it is the secret family recipe. It was isolated, I don't know, over a century ago. They have it kept in refrigerators that are more like safes, right? Locked down. They have samples of these being carried around the place and under sort of really close security. They don't want anyone else stealing their yeast strain either. So it's not only is it intrinsic to their product, it's intrinsic to the protection of their brand. And then, they have protocols for replacing this because it mutates. And so they have to constantly be creating the same strain as a sort of new generation, if you like, and then, making checks on that and everything. So the whole sort of process is geared up towards consistency and ensuring that nothing can possibly change, which, as you say, sort of flies in the face of how these products would have been traditionally made. I actually think there's probably space in the marketplace for both. Like, I think it's quite nice to have these products that you can rely on being completely consistent, and then other products where the changeability of it is actually what makes it special. And from season to season, year to year, whatever, maybe it's even batch to batch of sourdough, like you say, it changes a little bit, and then that gives you opportunity to sort of go, well, I like this more than that, and I like that more than that, and you can kind of almost better establish your preferences and get a little bit more enjoyment out of the experience consuming it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, absolutely. Like, I'm much more interested in, tasting, sort of small batch, products, that are made, with more variability, and not only variability in terms of the fermentation organisms, but let's say like a spirit like mezcal. Like, I love trying mezcals, made from, different varietals of maguey in different places.
Should have brought you. I've just published a book this year on tequila and mezcal. I should have brought you a copy. I spent a lot of time in Mexico last year touring mezcal distilleries. Yeah.
So there's a ton of variability.
Yeah.
Some of it has to do with the yeast, but I would say more of it has to do with the botanical the plants that they're working with, and also small variations in the process.
Yeah, I did write a little bit about this in the book, and a lot of the mezcal producers, as I'm sure you're aware, and this isn't to sort of like diminish their skill or anything, but they are behaving in much the same way as a whiskey producer might have done 200 years ago. They are very sensitive to their process. They understand the conditions, they understand the flavors that come out of it, but they are, for the most part, fairly ignorant to the microbiology of it. They're obviously not, there's a few exceptions to this, but for the vast majority of the sort of mezcal producers we're talking about, they're not cultivating specific yeast strains to use on their product. They're just letting it all occur naturally. And as you say, that is, I think, really the beauty in it and why it's getting so much attention at the moment, because it does hark back to this sort of more simpler, maybe sort of less contrived, more honest way of making spirits. And that's clear in the final liquid outcome as well, because you do get variability in it, obviously between distillers, but also between years. And it just feels like a slightly more natural and honest expression of the land, of the plant itself, of the microbiota that are affecting that plant when they're making it, and of the people that are making it who don't care if it tastes different from one year to another. They just care that they made it the way that they make it and they like the way it tastes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that I'm just thinking about is I ran into a guy some years ago in Nashville who called himself a yeast bioprospector. And he was going around, visiting farms, walking in forests, and just taking from plants just natural samples of yeast that he just found, around in different kinds of environments, and then making small batches of beer with them, and then just trying to, identify new wild strains of yeast that would have applications for, commercial fermentation. So, even taking the idea that it's desirable to work with predictable yeasts, we're working with such a narrow range of the yeasts that are available. It's exciting to me when people are seeking to identify, sort of new local strains of yeast that, might have potential. So, even taking as a given, using some predictable strain of yeast, we're just, it's just the tip of the iceberg, what we're working with. There's a lot, more variety we could be working with.
Yeah, it's kind of a single dimension, isn't it? I mean, a lot of these yeasts, I think, are probably isolated for their efficiency amongst anything else, like tolerance to alcohol or whatever. They can work fast. They can create a high yield from the substrate. I mean, certainly I think that's true of a lot of the mass market, high production volume spirits producers. If you look at something like a lot of the vodka industry would be like that, I'd imagine, where flavor is less important for most brands. But I wonder, even if you are isolating a yeast and you're pitching that into your fermentation, whether you're surely not eradicating all other potential yeast cultures and bacteria cultures from that circumstance, right? It's quite likely, especially in longer fermentations, as the conditions change, the acidity goes, the pH goes down, the alcohol goes up, the new cultures start to kind of go, well, actually, I quite like that circumstance. I'll get involved as well now.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends. I mean, different categories of spirits. I mean, when you're working with a raw substrate, there's always going to be biodiversity. When you're working with a substrate that has been cooked, then then most of your biodiversity has been destroyed by heat, and so you're introducing something that could be unique, but it's unique. Its ability to remain the only organism there depends on the condition. Are you sealing it in some vessel that's effectively preventing other organisms from accessing it? Are you doing some sort of an open fermentation that, where ambient organisms that might be floating on dust through the air could land on them? So, it just depends.
What are some of the most interesting experiments with alcohol fermentation that you've done?
Well, I've been really, I do a lot of rice alcohol. I make a lot of rice alcohol, and I've played around with very simple techniques for making sake style, but I also love fermenting with they're called Chinese yeast balls, ju chu, and they're these little chalky balls, let's say smaller than a golf ball. You can buy them everywhere. I'm sure in London you can buy them in Asian markets, all around New York, where I live in Tennessee. They're just everywhere. And you just make alcohol. I'm sorry, you cook up some rice, you crush one of these yeast balls. They have they have enzymes from molds like Koji, and they also have yeast in them, and then you mix them in with the cooked and cooled rice and some water, and a week or 10 days later, you have, beautiful, simple rice alcohol.
So they're just little cultured balls that you're ready just to pop in like a bath bomb.
Yeah, you have to crush it a little bit, and turn it into powder and crumbs, in order to distribute it well. But yeah, something like that. So I love doing that. I love making mead. Mead is super simple. Mead is honey alcohol. Pure honey, of course, won't ferment. It can sit on a shelf in your kitchen for years, but as soon as a little bit of water gets in there, it'll start to ferment. And so, I do a lot of fruit meads. Actually, I think next week when I go home, I've been noticing the sumac is all bright red. So I think I'm going to make some sumac mead, which is really delicious.
Do you tend to do flavored meads, or do you do just plain honey meads as well?
I mean, I do it both ways. Mostly, I end up doing it with flavorings. I've made some. I've been growing turmeric the last few years in my garden, and I've been doing like a turmeric mead that's really great. I love the sumac in mead. But I mean, also honey has its own beautiful flavors, and of course, honey doesn't have a singular flavor. You can have honeys, from all kinds of different flowers. That have
Yeah,
very
totally
distinctive
different.
colors,
Yeah.
distinctive flavors. So, you can make beautiful mead that's simple. Most of the traditional methods that I've been able to learn about have some kind of botanical elements, whether it's bitter herbs or whether it's fruits.
Yeah, I'm looking at getting a honey expert on the podcast actually, because that is a whole world of interesting things there. Um, do you just let it wild ferment the mead?
Yeah. I mean, I really haven't used like a packet of yeast really in 30 something years. There's just no need to. I mean, if you have raw honey has yeast in it.
Yeah.
If you're adding any kind of botanical ingredient, that'll have a yeast in it. Even if you're using pasteurized honey from the supermarket and no botanical elements, then yeast from the air will find it very quickly. For people trying to make wild fermented alcoholic beverages at home, any kind, I mean, I would just say the most important thing is stirring. Because if it's coming from the air, it'll land on the surface and you need to distribute it. If it's coming from berries or flowers or the leaves of plants, then your activity is just going to be around those elements and you want to distribute it. Turns out that, yeast, much like the cells of our bodies, are capable of both respiration and fermentation, and vigorous stirring provides oxygen, which enables them to reproduce much more rapidly under respiration than they can under anaerobic fermentation. And the other thing is, if you fail to stir, especially in the early period, it'll get really moldy on the surface. So just like stirring will prevent molds from ever being able to develop, they'll distribute the activity, they'll aerate the yeast. Whether I'm making, blackberry wine with, blackberries in a sugar water solution, blueberry wine,
So for those, you just use sugar, water, and the fruit, and then get it to the right sort of bricks, the right sweetness, and then let the fermentation go.
Yeah. I'd stir it, keep stirring it until the fermentation gets really, really vigorous, and then until it begins to slow down. So about 10 days, and then I would strain out the fruit, which is spent by that point anyway, and then I would transfer it into a jug with a narrow neck and put in one of those little airlocks.
Yeah.
And let it ferment for some months. Because you get diminishing returns. And let's say in the first 10 days, you'll get about half of the potential alcohol, and then the other half will take some months. But as it slows down, it's really important to protect it from oxygen. Otherwise, those pesky acetobacter can develop, which will convert the alcohol into acetic acid.
And that's when you get vinegar.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is there to say about sterilization?
Well, I mean, sterilization largely is a fantasy that we've been sold. And yeah, sure. I mean, if you're running a big brewery, if you're running a big distillery, there are reasons to use sanitizing chemicals. If you're doing small scale home fermentation, you can use these chemicals that'll sterilize things briefly. You'll rinse them with your water that's not sterile. You'll put them in your dish drying rack that's not sterile with your hands that are not sterile. And then the air in your home, which is never sterile, is going to be blowing around them. The point is, sterility is not necessary. Like, cleanliness is really important. Soap and water are your friends. You want your hands to be clean. You want your tools to be clean. You want your fermentation vessels to be clean. But whether you're talking about a spontaneous wild fermentation or you're introducing pure culture yeast, either way, there's going to be sort of a critical mass of yeast activity that is going to make the, random exposure to ambient bacteria insignificant.
Yeah, it will just muscle it out, basically.
Yeah.
So really, it's a basic level of cleanliness, which you would normally, hopefully, do with any kind of food preparation, soap and water, and then creating the right environment for the culture that you want to support, so that culture, it's like a board game of Risk, right? Where you want to dominate the entire world. You want that culture to be the one that wins.
Yeah.
Okay, got it. Anything else on alcohol that you've done that's fun from around? Any other sort of traditions from around the world that you've had a go at? You mentioned rice and sort of sake style rice brewing.
Well, I think the important thing for people to recognize is that, we have our ideas about, barley is turned into beer, grapes are turned into wine, a range of other things are turned into spirits, but like any carbohydrate source you can imagine can be turned into alcohol. we were talking about tomatoes earlier. I've had tomato wine. In Central Asia, they make alcohol out of milk.
Yes. What was tomato wine like?
It was
Tomato flavored wine.
yeah. No, but it was actually delicious.
Yeah. Did it maintain quite a savory quality to it?
Yeah.
I'm thinking like tomato juice mixed with vodka. Was it something like that, or was it sort of?
It wasn't that tomatoey.
No.
No. Because most of the solids mostly drop out.
Yeah, sure. So you
And
got
so
it.
you have the essence of it.
Yeah.
It's more like drinking, if you've ever had like the tomato water.
Yeah, sure.
Residue.
But alcoholic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and imagine carbonated, that would be pretty good as well.
You mentioned pineapples earlier. I do a lot of lightly fermented beverages. So, something like Mexican tepache, where you use the skins of the pineapple in a sugar water solution, maybe with some cinnamon, and other seasonings. And you generally ferment it for like a short time. In South America, a lot of styles of chicha use the skins of pineapple as a starter for the chicha. But you also can make pineapple alcohol. So, in Colombia, I encountered something called guarapo de piña that was just made from like grated pineapple. In Hawaii, I had, wine that was made from pineapples. But, really like any fruit that's in your environment in abundance can be turned into alcohol. And I know, in the UK, you have this, amazing traditions of country wines. And I've had like parsnip wine, sloe wine, plum wine. But, really like any kind of, fruit or flowers can be used to flavor wine. The possibilities are really pretty infinite.
I get some loads of meadowsweet growing in my garden. I don't know if it's called meadow. Do you know what meadowsweet is? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's got a different name in the States. Amazing flower. Kind of almondy, vanilla-y, and then floral as well. And I pick it all and turn it into a syrup, but I'm going to ferment some of it and see how it comes out. I think it will be somewhere on the line of like elderflower champagne, when you ferment elderflowers and get that.
But this idea of like lightly fermented beverages, I think totally has a place in in the bartender's palate, because I mean, these lightly fermented beverages are wonderful as like mixers with spirits.
Yeah.
Some friends of mine who used to have a restaurant in San Francisco, I remember they were making an orange blossom cordial. Like when the orange trees were blossoming, they would buy a big bucket of orange blossoms, mix them with sugar water, let them ferment for a relatively short time, but they'd have this incredibly aromatic, very lightly fermented beverage. You could just as well do a syrup like that, and then use that to make these beautiful aromatic cocktails.
Yeah, and then you have this sort of category of ferments called sort of fermented tonic drinks. So
Yeah, that's what a lightly fermented beverage is the same as these
same thing. So kombucha would fit into this. Root beer,
Ginger
beer.
But you could take those same ideas and do lots of different things. Like, in Japan, people sometimes do that with pine needles and make like a little pine needle soda. That has a beautiful, delicate flavor. In Alaska, I had the same idea with spruce tips. That just have the most like delicate aroma. But you can take this basic concept for lightly fermented beverages and do lots of different things. Like you can do the same idea as ginger beer, but with turmeric. And that's, beautiful and has that, bright orange yellow color.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you can use sort of something like you can make a ginger bug, right? So I've sort of fermented ginger starter, but then use that as a starter for a different substrate. So you could ferment another fruit using ginger as the basis. And then so obviously the number of combinations then just goes
No, there are infinite permutations. Like, really, our imaginations are the only limitation.
And then does it taste good? Of course.
Well, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not every combination is going to be delicious.
When I was in Mexico, actually, I had a mango spirit. And this was not a spirit that had been distilled and then flavored with mango. It was fermented mango made into a mango wine, presumably. I didn't get to try that part of it. But as we were saying earlier, all the fruit or all the veg are ready at the same time. What do you do with it? Well, you ferment it. But obviously wine, I mean, some wines can be bottled and stored for years and years and years. Other ones, maybe not so much. I guess what this guy was thinking was, well, I've preserved it to some extent by turning it into a wine. Now I need to distill it to make it bulletproof, basically. It was really interesting, the flavor of it. It was not like fresh mango. It was more like dry. You get that dry, sticky mango. It was like that when you smell it. The taste was quite subtle, strong, because it's a spirit. But if you add a little bit of sugar to it, then it just brings out the mango again. It's like revisiting that mango, when it was fresh or partially dried.
Well, that sounds delicious.
Yeah,
I love mango flavor. I'd love to try that.
Water kefir. What is that exactly? Because I feel like this is another tool that bartenders possibly could exploit.
Sure. So water kefir is it's an example of a SCOBY, a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast, analogous to kombucha. Whereas the kombucha SCOBY is like a rubbery pancake that floats on top of sweetened tea. Water kefir is like these little crystalline structures, but it's embodied in that crystalline structure is a community of yeast and lactic and acetic bacteria. I mean, they can ferment virtually any carbohydrate. It seems like water kefir originally comes from Mexico, where it's known as tibicos, but generally people do, fruit-infused sugar water and ferment it using that. You can make it effervescent. It'll become a little bit alcoholic, a little bit acidic. Of course, how much depends on how long you leave it for. and then the crystals grow, so you end up over time with more of them.
Yeah.
But I mean, it can be it's another way to make these lightly fermented beverages that you can either just drink as they are, or you can use as components of cocktails.
Yeah, and they produce very little alcohol.
I mean, they produce some alcohol. I mean, you couldn't really call that an alcoholic beverage. You would need to drink such an extraordinary amount of it.
Yeah.
But I mean, I have a friend who's a recovering alcoholic who tried water kefir at my place one time and just like spit it out and said
Really?
like he felt like that would be a trigger for him.
Really?
And I mean, there certainly can be 1 or 2% alcohol in it.
Yeah, interesting. And kombucha as well.
And then the other thing is, like in the UK, you have a lot of water kefir that's commercially available. Here we have less of it because in the UK, anything below 1% alcohol is non-alcoholic. In the US, it has to be below 0.5% alcohol.
Interesting.
And so, although people can do that more reliably with kombucha, it's really hard to do with water kefir. So it just intrinsically has a slightly higher level of alcohol than kombucha.
That's interesting. Yeah, what do you think about the commercialization of some of these products? I mean, my own take is, and kombucha seems to be the biggest of these. It seems to be everywhere now. In fact, in the taxi on the way here today, I was following a truck that had a massive kombucha advert on the back of it. I went to get water for us, and the store was just full of different kombucha brands. They seem to be very hit and miss in my experience. I mean, a lot of these products, I guess, pasteurized, apart from anything else. So there's no live culture in there. But most of them, for me, just taste like any other soft drink. They're lacking the acidity, they're lacking the depth. Yeah, I get it. Most people don't want to drink a kombucha that is sort of like, it's had like a decent measure of vinegar thrown into it, which I quite like when the kombuchas are that sour. But I get it. It's not for everyone. But a lot of the ones I try, I'm like, come on, guys, this is just blackcurrant soda,
Yeah, well, I'm with you, and to some degree, people are responding to consumer desire, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who, grew up drinking soda, and then they see all the hype about kombucha, and they're like, oh, okay, this is a healthier alternative that tastes almost the same as the soda that I grew up drinking. I don't know, when I first was introduced to kombucha in the mid 90s, I mean, there was no commercial kombucha in the US. It was, exclusively like a little kind of grassroots thing where, people who were making it were sharing kombucha mothers with their friends.
One of the cool things about it, right?
And
Because it keeps on growing. You can just give it to people, right?
Yeah. But I mean, and I absolutely agree with you that like there's a huge amount of variability in the quality of the products. But some of them are great. What I would generally counsel people is to, not buy the ones that are sold to a national market. Like look for smaller, like local and regional brands, and they're much more likely to be the real thing, alive, not pasteurized, made the traditional way. I mean, some of them are just, not even making it with traditional kombucha mothers.
There's no regulation around what you can do.
Yeah, but I mean, I would say that's true sort of
Yeah.
of everything. I mean, I love cheese. It's easy for me to see this series of steps that ended up with like individually wrapped slices of, plasticky looking cheese. But that's, that's not my jam, but some people love that. And, with bread, I mean, I love a sort of assertively sour whole grain, a loaf of bread. Supermarket shelves are full of this like, fluffy white bread that's, in some cases not fermented at all, in many cases fermented just with pure culture yeast. I don't know, mass production. I'd be content if like, all of our, centrally produced foods disappeared and, we were forced to decentralize the production of food. But, here we are living in a, Tesco and Walmart world. And, producers are responding to what sells.
Yeah.
But there is some great kombucha out there, but I mean, there's a lot more terrible kombucha.
Yeah,
out there.
I guess that's the problem, isn't it? Because considering it's still a pretty, although it's emerged quite fast, it's still an emerging category of product, fermented product. And so for the authentic producers of it, they face a huge challenge, A, in that still there's people that don't know about it, and B, there's a lot of, misinformation or just bad products out there that are effectively denaturing the name of kombucha, because a lot of people's first interaction with that product is like, oh, well, it just kind of tastes like any other soda.
Yeah. No, I mean,
And they've got artificial sweeteners in them a lot of time as well. And
I'm totally with you, but I'll offer you a contrasting example: beer. I mean, today there's like so much more variety of excellent beer available. I mean, almost everywhere, as far as I can tell, than a generation ago. So, because people are developing, more discerning tastes.
yeah, some people are. I mean, I guess the market stratifies, doesn't it? You just get people section off into different parts of the market. There'll be people who will go out and seek the craft beers and the weird beers that have very strange flavors, or we could be talking about whiskey, or we could be talking about kombucha or any other product, cheese. And then you get the people who, don't really care that much about it. And then there's people in the middle who will occasionally move from one direction to the other,
Yeah.
So, kombucha, it's one of those things that feels like it's ancient. The name sort of suggests that. What are the origins of it?
I mean, a little bit murky. I mean, the origins of all fermented foods and beverages are a little bit murky. It seems like it comes from the north of China, and it seems to be fairly ancient, although I couldn't really say how ancient. But I also couldn't say how ancient wine is, or beer is, or bread is, or sauerkraut is, because the reality is that all of these fermentations predate recorded history. And so, all we can do is speculate. I can tell you that, more than 100 years ago, kombucha was very popular in Russia. So, I mean, it's gone through waves of popularity in a lot of different places. But, it does seem to have an ancient lineage, but I certainly couldn't tell you how ancient.
Koji, sort of moving away from drink. Well, not entirely away from drinks, because Koji is used for many different things, but it seems to be like one of the kind of poster children of the fermentation movement. It's very sexy. You see it a lot in like top restaurants. It's being used. Obviously, it has its history in Japanese food culture, and Japanese culture in itself, especially food and drink, is really kind of considered to be at the highest end in terms of global food culture, and the attention to detail, and the methods, and the incredibly long-winded preparations that goes into a lot of their food and drink. What can you say about it in terms of its sort of flavor creating properties and its uses and applications?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Koji is very sexy. You walk into a room where Koji is growing, and it's just like it's just like such a appealing aroma. And if someone had told me 30 years ago that, like, I would fall in love with the smell of a mold that's growing, I would have thought that was ridiculous. But I mean, I love being in a space where Koji is growing. I love growing Koji in my home. So what Koji is, it's a Japanese name for a particular kind of fungus grown on rice, barley, soybeans would be the primary traditional substrates for it. Koji's the Japanese name, but similar molds are used in cuisines all across Asia. In China, in Korea, in Southeast Asia, even in India. So Koji has many different applications. Koji and its related its cousins in other cuisines. The most widespread one would be to make alcohol out of rice and sometimes millet or barley or other kinds of grains. but also to make soy sauce, to make miso, to make mirin, to make certain sweet desserts like in Indonesia, tape. I mean, the way that Koji and the related molds create such diverse products. I mean, sake has very different qualities from soy sauce.
Yeah.
But it's because they have so many enzymes. So enzymes are these chemical catalysts that are produced by cells. So that's how cells perform their metabolism through enzymes that they produce. And it happens that this fungus creates an incredible array of enzymes, something like 70 something distinct enzymes. And these include amylase enzymes that can break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. This is the one that's essential for sake and other rice alcohols, because yeast can't access the complex carbohydrates of grains without some sort of enzymatic breakdown into simple sugars that yeast can access. Then there's also protease enzymes that break down proteins into amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. It happens that, when you break down proteins into amino acids, you make for much fuller flavors. The flavor that in Japanese has come to be known as umami is really the flavor of certain amino acids. So, if you compare the flavor of a soybean that is simply soaked and cooked to the flavor of soy sauce, you can see that, wow, okay, the soybean has very plain, mild flavor, and then the flavor really explodes when you turn it into soy sauce, and you get a much stronger, more assertive flavor. Think about milk compared to cheese. Milk is so mild and plain in its flavor.
Yeah.
And then, think about some of the flavors that develop in aged cheeses. And, you can see that contained within the protein are extraordinary flavors, and the protease enzymes that break down proteins into amino acids really unleash the flavor potential in a lot of protein-rich kinds of foods. And then there's also lipase enzymes that break down fats and produce fatty acids. So, there's a lot of different kinds of enzymes that can work on different macronutrients. And so there's an incredible diversity of culinary applications of Koji and the Chinese chu and the Korean meiju. There's a lot of different particulars, but these molds are really incredible and important for producing alcohol, but also important for making all of these savory foods and for making certain very sweet foods. Amazake is a Japanese generally beverage, sometimes porridge, that's intensely sweet, no sugar added. It's just basically rice decomposed using these enzymes.
Yeah, to break down those long carbohydrates into sweeter tasting ones. I went some years ago. I went to Noma in Copenhagen, and they showed me around the fermentation lab as it was then. And a lot of what they were doing was with Koji, but of course they were using it on local substrates. I can't remember exactly what they were doing it on. I think they were doing it on barley, possibly something with some other bean or lentil or chickpea or something or other that was sort of more local or appropriate to the area. And this is where you start to get incredible things, because it's sort of the ultimate fusion food in a way. You're taking the sort of local substrate, the thing that grows in abundance, but then you're bringing in this mold that is more associated with another cuisine, combine them together, and then see what comes out afterwards when you're not using a soybean. It's really, really interesting. And I think possibly, we see it in a lot of restaurants now, and even in bars are starting to explore fermentation in this way as a sort of flavor creating tool. that they can add to cocktails.
Yeah, no, totally. But I mean, I would just point out that in cocktails, like, okay, you have some olives, you have some cocktail onions, like, these involve fermentation. So you have like a lot of like traditional elements like that can involve fermentation. Let's say like the idea of like, salting the rim of a glass. I mean, you can also dehydrate kimchi, and you can use that in a similar way on the rim of a glass. You can take brine, saturate it with salt, dehydrate that, and have salt crystals that actually have some of the other funky byproducts of fermentation. You can create unique garnishes using fermentation. So yeah, I mean, I think fermentation has a lot of roles in bars, including I see bartenders using powdered koji sometimes as an element.
You can eat it, can't you? I haven't eaten it myself, but you can eat.
Yeah, sure. I mean, koji generally is not used as a food. It's sort of the first step in a multi-step process. But I mean, it's delicious, and you certainly can eat koji, and more and more I'm seeing powdered koji as as an element in either dishes served at restaurants or cocktails served in bars.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like you've mentioned a few examples of fermented products that can be used in cocktails, but I guess what I was getting at was actually that we're seeing so many more restaurants, especially, but bars where they've got sort of in-house fermentation protocols going on. There's probably a few dozen bars around the world now where they have rooms that are specifically dedicated to fermentation. I think also it goes hand in hand with the movement towards sustainability and reducing waste as well, because as you've already emphasized, a lot of parts of products that would normally be wasted, like the skin of a pineapple, can be fermented and then turned into something that's delicious. That is doing a number of things. First of all, it's reducing the amount of stuff that you're chucking away. Secondly, it is creating something delicious that you're going to serve to your guests. Thirdly, it's also creating a kind of story, a narrative around what it is you're doing that then elevates the value that the guests get when they come along to your restaurants. Like, we've done this, lacto-fermented potato skin, or koji potato skin infusion that is now being put into a sauce that's going on your dish, and it's going to add these flavors, it's going to add that. It adds value to the whole thing, and there's sort of this strange irony in a way that, like, a lot of the practices that would have been sort of fundamental to just getting on with your life a few hundred years ago, like not wasting this, preserving that, being economical with what it is you have to buy, growing as much as you can, is now the kind of it's what is heralded as the sort of ultimate in cuisine and in hospitality and in the highest end of restaurants, and you have to pay a huge amount of money for it quite often.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in high-end restaurant world, a lot of chefs are tapping into the potential of fermentation to create extraordinary flavors. And there's a lot of creativity and innovation, and that's exciting to see. But I would just say that every restaurant in the world is serving things that are fermented, not necessarily in the restaurant, but any kind of condiment or seasoning generally involves fermentation. Bread and cheese and these things. So, yeah, sure. I mean, lots of high-end chefs are working with fermentation, but fermentation is not at all restricted to that world. It's just, in that world, there's the people power, there's the space to devote to that kind of creativity.
And the marketability of it, because you are a restaurant, you can shout about what you're doing and you can write it on a menu and you can draw people in that way.
But what I would just say is I think that, there's just as much innovation, more innovation happening in people's home kitchens. Like you don't have to be the chef of a Michelin star restaurant to, derive the the flavor benefits of fermentation. And if you have the money to eat in restaurants like that, more power to you. But there's a lot of people just experimenting in small ways at home, or they're just, from traditions that have been always fermenting things and, producing these kinds of delicacies. And, sometimes in the West, fermentation gets this rap of being like, for affluent people. And I get that like, a lot of the people who are, really like seeking out fermented products are affluent people. But, fermentation just has always been driven by necessity. And, there's just as many stories of places in the world where, fermentation has the association of people who are living subsistence lives in small villages. And, if people become affluent and move into bigger cities, they're like leaving that behind. So, it's like we're taking these practices that really emerged as practical survival practices. And then, sometimes people want to leave them behind when they're, making their way in bigger cities. But then we have like, the most famous restaurants who are sort of using fermentation to capture ever more flavor. So it's like an interesting cycle and conundrum. But I mean, the things that I think are just truths are that fermentation can create really extraordinary flavors and has applications way beyond the traditional applications that people who are creative and imaginative can definitely like apply traditional processes in incredibly innovative ways to have really new and frequently delicious results.
Just to finish up, what, if you had to pick one thing, is the most deliciously wonderful tasting fermented thing you've ever eaten or drunk? Life-changing kind of epiphany level of deliciousness. Because the thing is, it has that potential, right? Like, obviously, just look at alcohol, just look at wine, right? It has that potential. So is there something you can put your finger on?
It's so hard for me to just pick like one thing. Like, part of the excitement of fermentation for me is the diversity of it, like how different it can be. I mean, I love cheese. I mean, I've had some really extraordinary cheeses. So cheese would be one area that's very, very close to my heart. But I'll tell you that I've been kind of obsessed with some different styles of fermenting tofu, and over the last year I've been making Sourdough, which is a Chinese and Taiwanese style of fermenting tofu. It's usually translated into English as stinky tofu.
Okay.
So that tells you like not everybody is going to love it.
Again, we got this PR problem with fermented products.
So but it ends up with this like very like complex, beautiful, even sweet flavor. Maybe something akin to blue cheese.
Yeah.
But with a really strong smell that challenges many people. So
do you consider yourself someone who has a naturally higher tolerance to, let's say, lactic acid or fermented flavors, or do you think it's pure acquisition through repeated exposure over the years?
Well, I mean, I would say that, very early in my life, I was exposed to a lot of strong lactic foods. And so like that one's really
Just primed you.
hardwired into me. But I mean, a lot of these other flavors are much funkier than the flavor of lactic acid.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think I try to be open-minded. I don't always love everything the first time I tried it, that I try it. But generally, especially if I see other people taking great pleasure in something, I'm generally willing to give it a second.
Exactly like that as well. It's like if there's something there and I can't find it, then I'm jealous. It's FOMO basically. I'm like, I'm gonna have to keep at this. A long time I didn't like mushrooms. I don't know, it was childhood aversion, just didn't like them. But I knew that there was something there, you know, people who obsess over different types of mushrooms and the intensity of flavor, you can get them in cooking and everything.
I was in my mid-40s before I started enjoying olives.
Really?
So,
there you go. But you're right. If you feel like you're missing out, you just keep persevering. Anything in particular that you can think of where either it's just you've been weirded out by it, it's just too much, too strange, or outright disgusting? I mean, a lot of people don't get on with fermented fish very well, right? Some of these canned Nordic fishes.
Well, you're specifically talking about surströmming, which is the only one that I've heard of ever in a can. So sure. I mean, that's exactly like that. Like I first encountered it at a conference in the UK, and the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, and there was this academic from Sweden doing a paper about surströmming, and there was a little huddle of the organizers, and they decided to move the tasting outside, and she had these bulging cans of surströmming,
they sometimes
and then opened them up, and then I was on the line waiting to taste some, and the smell was kind of overpowering, and I was wondering, like, oh my God, am I going to be able to eat this? But then, once I had my little sandwich that was like a flatbread and some sour cream and some onion and then a little bit of the fish, I ate it and it was delicious, and it left this aftertaste in my mouth that made me just want more. So I sort of, I kind of lingered to see like whether there would be some left at the end that I could have some more. And I mean, I love surströmming. It's
oftentimes the smell of certain fermented foods is weirder than the taste. And often because you don't have association necessarily. I mean, the smell of a lot of blue cheeses, if you had it in isolation and you'd never eaten blue cheese before, most people I think would be like, oh my God, that's too much. And obviously some people, even as adults, are like that. They just don't like blue cheese. But once you find the connection between the taste of blue cheese, which is in some ways less intense than the aroma of blue cheese, it's different because you have the acidity, you have the creaminess, you have the sweetness, the umami, all of those different characteristics, plus the aromatic volatiles at the same time. It's somehow easier to get along with than just that pungent, ripe blue cheese smell. I suspect surströmming is exactly the same, right? It stinks. I mean, and durian fruit is another great example of this. Stinks more than it tastes bad.
Yeah. But, I would just point out that, all alcohol generally tastes bad to people the first time they taste it.
Yeah,
like,
true.
I mean, the first time like a kid has a sip of their parents' beer, I mean, why are you drinking this? This tastes terrible. So, it's only because we sort of, watch the adults in our life taking pleasure that we like.
I've got to keep at this. Yeah, no, exactly. Cool. Well, look, fantastic conversation. Sandor Katz, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks for having me.